The heavy oak doors of the great hall echoed with the finality of a death sentence. "You are banished from the Silver Pine Pack," her father roared, condemning her to the freezing wilds. But before the guards could touch her, the shadows parted. The Alpha King stepped forward. "She is joining mine." The winter of 1342 was brutal, but the chill within the great hall of the Sinclair Keep was far colder than the blizzards howling outside. Lady Genevieve Sinclair knelt on the unforgiving cobblestone floor, her knees bruised and her velvet gown torn at the shoulder. Blood dried and flaking crusted her lower lip. Yet despite the pain throbbing in her jaw and the terrifying reality of her situation, she kept her spine entirely straight. She refused to tremble. She refused to give the assembly of murmuring elders the satisfaction of her fear. High above her, on the carved wooden dais, sat Lord Reginald Sinclair Alpha of the Silver Pine Pack, and the man Genevieve had called father for 22 years. His face, usually a mask of stoic leadership, was currently contorted in absolute fury. The firelight from the massive hearth cast harsh, dancing shadows across his scarred visage, making him look less like a father and more like a monstrous stranger. Standing to the right of the dais, dabbing at his cheek with a silk handkerchief, was Lord Frederick Baines. Frederick was the heir to the wealthiest territory in the southern valleys, a man known for his cruel appetites and heavily perfumed cloaks. Beneath the silk handkerchief lay 4 deep, ragged claw marks, a permanent ruin to his handsome face. Genevieve had put them there. "You stand before the Council of Elders, Genevieve of House Sinclair." Reginald's voice boomed, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and stone archways adorned with the silver pine crests. "You are accused of the highest treason against your own pack, unprovoked assault upon your betrothed Lord Frederick Baines, a male of superior rank, a lord who offered us prosperity." It was not unprovoked. Genevieve said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the sandpaper dryness of her throat. "He tried to force the mating mark in the Western Gardens. We were not yet wed. The moon had not yet blessed the union. He cornered me like prey. Lies from a hysterical female." Frederick sneered, lowering the handkerchief. The fresh wounds oozed a stark contrast to his pale skin. "I merely offered her an embrace to warm her in the evening chill. She shifted her claws and attacked me like a feral cur. Her wolf is unstable, Reginald. She is dangerous." A collective gasp echoed from the gathered pack members. In their society, a wolf that could not control its shift was deemed a liability, a throwback to the savage beasts they had evolved from centuries ago. Genevieve looked at her father desperately, searching for a flicker of paternal instinct, a shred of belief. But Reginald's eyes were cold, calculating. The Sinclair pack was starving. The harsh winters had frozen their rivers and killed their game. Frederick Baines had promised grain cattle and access to the rich coal mines of the south. In Reginald's eyes, Genevieve was not a daughter. She was a political currency, and she had just severely devalued herself. "Silence!" Reginald roared, slamming his fist onto the armrest of his chair. "You have brought shame upon our lineage. You have broken the sacred laws of hospitality and hierarchy. I offered you a life of luxury, a chance to save your people, and you answered with savagery." "I answered with self-defense," Genevieve yelled, finally letting her composure crack. "My wolf reacted to a threat. He reeked of blood and malice, father. You cannot bind me to a monster. The only monster here is the one kneeling on my floor," Reginald said softly. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than his shouts. He stood up, slowly descending the stone steps of the dais. The elders Desmond and Gregory nodded in solemn agreement. The verdict had been decided before Genevieve had even been dragged into the hall. Reginald stopped a few feet from her. "By the laws of our ancestors, an attack on an allied lord is punishable by death. But I am a merciful Alpha, and I will not spill Sinclair blood on my own hearth. Genevieve's heart pounded violently against her ribs. She knew what was coming. It was a fate many considered worse than death. Genevieve Sinclair. Reginald proclaimed his voice, resonating with the ancient magic of an Alpha's command. For your crimes against the Silverpine Pack, for your defiance and your savagery, I strip you of your name. I strip you of your colors. With a sickening tear, Reginald stepped forward and violently ripped the silver and green sash from her bodice, the symbol of her heritage. You're banished from the pack. Her father decreed, his eyes devoid of any lingering warmth. The words were not just a sentence. They were a magical severing. Genevieve screamed in agony as the pack bond, the invisible vital tether that connected her soul to the collective warmth and strength of her people, snapped violently inside her chest. It felt as though a hot iron had been plunged into her heart. She collapsed forward onto her hands, gasping for air. Tears finally spilling from her eyes, as an unnatural, freezing emptiness rushed into the void where her pack had once been. She was a rogue, a lone wolf in the dead of winter. Take her to the blizzard gates. Reginald ordered his guards, turning his back on his weeping daughter. Throw her into the howling wastes. If the winter does not claim her, the wild things will. Two massive guards, Braddock and Kyle, stepped forward, their faces grim but obedient. They grabbed Genevieve by the arms, hauling her to her feet. She was too weak from the severing of the bond to fight them. As they dragged her toward the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall, the pack members turned their backs to her, a final silent gesture of shunning. Frederick Baines offered her a wicked, triumphant smirk. "Enjoy the cold, little wolf," he mouthed. Genevieve closed her eyes, preparing herself for the biting wind of the storm outside. But she never felt the cold. Boom! The sound was like a cannon firing within the enclosed stone hall. The massive iron-reinforced oak doors at the entrance of the keep burst open with such terrifying force that they shattered the stone frames, sending heavy splinters of wood flying across the room. The winter storm roared into the great hall, extinguishing half the torches in an instant. But it was not just the blizzard that swept into the room. It was an aura of such absolute crushing dominance that every wolf in the hall immediately fell to their knees. Genevieve, already weak, collapsed to the floor as the guards holding her let go to clutch their own throats, their bodies involuntarily submitting to the overwhelming pressure. The air grew thick, smelling of ozone, dark earth, and ancient power. Out of the swirling snow and darkness stepped a figure of legend. He was towering, standing well over 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to eclipse the archway. He wore a cloak of midnight fur over hardened leather armor. His hair was as dark as a raven's wing, falling around a face that was strikingly handsome yet incredibly lethal. A faint silver scar traced the edge of his square jaw, but it was his eyes that stopped the breath in Genevieve's lungs. They were a piercing, luminescent gold, the eyes of a true Alpha. Not just an Alpha, the Alpha. King Leander Grayson, the sovereign of the Lycan territories, had entered the Silverpine Keep. Behind him marched a dozen heavily armed warriors of the Obsidian Guard elite enforcers, who answered only to the king. They fanned out across the hall, their hands resting menacingly on the hilts of their broadswords. What is the meaning of this? Reginald stammered, fighting against the instinct to press his face to the floor. He managed to stay on one knee, his face pale with shock. "My king, we were not informed of your arrival." Leander ignored the Lord of Silverpine entirely. His golden eyes swept the room, taking in the cowering pack, the smug but suddenly terrified face of Frederick Baines, and finally the broken, bleeding girl kneeling on the cold stone floor. Leander's heavy boots echoed ominously as he walked down the center aisle. He stopped directly in front of Genevieve. For a moment, the crushing aura in the room softened just around her, allowing her to draw a trembling breath. "Get up!" Leander commanded, his voice, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated in her very bones. It was not an alpha's compulsion, but a genuine request. Genevieve struggled her limbs, shaking from the shock of the severed bond. Before she could fall back down, a massive, warm hand gripped her elbow effortlessly, pulling her to her feet. Leander looked down at her, his golden eyes scanning the bruised lip, the torn dress, and the utter despair on her face. A muscle feathered in his jaw. "My king." Reginald tried again, his voice trembling as he crawled a few paces forward. "Forgive the state of our hall. We were in the midst of dispensing justice. This female—" "Justice," Leander repeated, turning his head slowly toward Reginald. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "You call this justice, Reginald severing a pup from your pack in the dead of winter. She committed treason." Frederick Baines blurted out, unable to help himself. He pointed a shaking finger at Genevieve. "She attacked me, her betrothed. Look at my face. She is a feral beast." Leander released Genevieve's elbow and took slow, deliberate steps toward Frederick. The wealthy lord shrank back against the stone wall, his bravado evaporating under the sovereign's gaze. "I see your face, Lord Baines," Leander said, softly, looming over the smaller man. "I see a coward who attempts to force mating marks on unwilling females in the shadows." Frederick gasped, his eyes darting to Reginald for help, but Reginald was firmly looking at the floor. But more than that, Leander continued, his voice rising in volume so the entire hall could hear. "I see a traitor. Guards, 2 obsidian guards stepped forward instantly, seizing Frederick by the arms and forcing him to his knees. Lord Frederick Baines." Leander declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You are hereby under arrest by the Crown for high treason. For the past 2 years you have been smuggling silver-laced weaponry and refined wolfbane across the eastern borders, selling them to human poachers. You have traded the lives of your own kind for human gold." The great hall erupted into chaotic gasps and murmurs. Reginald's head snapped up, staring at Frederick in horror. If Frederick was a traitor, the Sinclair Pack's alliance with him would have marked them for execution by the Crown. "It's a lie!" Frederick shrieked, struggling against the guards. "I am a lord of the southern valleys. You have no proof. I have your ledgers," Leander said, simply nodding to his second-in-command, a massive warrior named Garrick, who held up a leather-bound book. "Found in your carriage outside this very keep." Leander turned back to Reginald, who was visibly shaking now, realizing how close he had come to aligning his pack with a dead man. "Your daughter, Statord," Leander said to Reginald, "did not commit a crime today. She drew the blood of a traitor. By rejecting his bite, she severed the tie that would have dragged your entire pack down to the executioner's block. She saved your miserable lives." Reginald looked at Genevieve, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I did not know, my king." "Genevieve, daughter, do not call her that." Leander snapped his aura, flaring so violently that the stonework cracked beneath his boots. "You stripped her of her name. You tore her from your pack. You threw her to the wolves." Leander walked back to Genevieve. He unfastened the heavy midnight fur cloak from his own shoulders and wrapped it gently around her trembling frame. It was overwhelmingly warm, smelling of pine needles, wood smoke, and a deeply comforting masculinity. Genevieve looked up at him, entirely bewildered. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind outside. "Why are you doing this?" Leander looked down into her wide, tear-filled eyes. The harshness in his expression melted away, replaced by something ancient and fiercely protective. "Because they are blind little wolf," Leander murmured low enough that only she could hear. "They do not know what sleeps in your blood." Leander turned back to face the stunned assembly, wrapping a protective arm around Genevieve's shoulders. "You're banished from the pack," her father decreed. Leander announced, his voice echoing through the broken doors and out into the howling winter night. He pulled Genevieve closer to his side. "She is joining mine." Without another word to the trembling Lord Sinclair or the whimpering Frederick Baines, King Leander Grayson guided Genevieve out of the keep and into the freezing blizzard. Outside, a massive black carriage, drawn by 6 armored war horses, awaited them. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but inside Leander's cloak, Genevieve felt a strange, budding warmth returning to her chest. The pack bond she had lost was an agonizing void, but as Leander helped her into the velvet-lined carriage, she felt a subtle, powerful thrumming deep within her soul, a spark recognizing an inferno. As the carriage lurched forward, leaving the only home she had ever known behind, Genevieve stared across the carriage at the Alpha King. He was watching her intensely, studying her with those golden eyes. "Where are we going?" she asked, pulling the fur tighter around herself. "To the Obsidian Citadel," Leander replied, leaning back against the leather seats. "You have much to learn, Genevieve. The war with the human kingdoms is escalating, and Baines was just one rotting branch on a dying tree. What does that have to do with me?" she asked. "I am just a disgraced lord's daughter, a wolf who cannot even control her shift properly." Leander chuckled a deep, rich sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You do not lack control, Genevieve. You lack an equal. Your wolf did not attack Frederick out of simple fear. She attacked him because he was an inferior male, attempting to claim a queen." Genevieve's breath hitched. "A queen, rest now," Leander commanded, softly, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, intoxicating promise. "The journey is long, and when we arrive, the entire world is going to find out exactly who they banished. The journey to the Obsidian Citadel took 3 days through the treacherous Frost Peak Mountains. When the carriage finally breached the mountain pass, Genevieve gasped. The citadel was not merely a castle, it was a fortress carved directly into the black volcanic rock of the mountain itself, its towering spires piercing the low-hanging winter clouds. Upon arrival, Genevieve was immediately placed under the care of the royal healer lady, Eleanor of House Hastings. Eleanor, a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair and a demeanor that commanded absolute obedience, treated Genevieve's bruises and forced her to drink bitter, steaming broths. "Your old pack bond is entirely severed," Lady Eleanor noted one evening, pressing a warm, glowing hand against Genevieve's chest. "But you have not withered. The king's cloak, his scent, he is anchoring your soul to ours. It is highly unorthodox, Lady Genevieve." Genevieve looked down at her hands. "He told me my wolf was not feral. He said I lacked an equal. What did he mean, Eleanor?" Eleanor sighed, packing away her linen bandages. "That is a conversation for the sovereign. He awaits you in the royal archives." The archives were a labyrinth of ancient knowledge, filled with towering bookshelves that smelled of dried parchment and beeswax candles. Genevieve found Leander standing by a massive oak table, tracing his finger over a beautifully illuminated map of the Lycan territories. He wore a simple black tunic, his powerful muscles shifting beneath the fabric, making her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You look better," Leander said, without looking up his heightened senses, having already registered her arrival. "I feel entirely out of place." "Your Grace," Genevieve admitted, stepping fully into the candlelight. Leander finally looked at her. His golden eyes swept over her new attire, a gown of deep sapphire velvet provided by the Citadel's tailors. "You look exactly where you belong. Come here." Genevieve approached the table. Leander slid an ancient leather-bound tome toward her. The pages were brittle, filled with intricate drawings of wolves that were significantly larger and more majestic than any she had ever seen in the Silver Pine Pack. For centuries our kind has believed the pure royal bloodlines were extinct. Leander began his voice, a low, mesmerizing hum in the quiet library. Wiped out during the Great Famine. The surviving packs mingled, diluting the old blood to ensure survival. But sometimes an anomaly occurs. A recessive trait resurfaces. He pointed to a specific illustration of a pure white wolf with silver markings around its eyes, a female standing victorious over a slain bear. The Lunar Queens. Leander read the text aloud, translating the ancient dialect seamlessly. Females of such raw, untamed power that they could not submit to the hierarchy of standard alphas. To attempt to dominate a lunar queen is to invite death. They do not join packs, they conquer them. Genevieve's breath hitched. She looked from the ancient drawing to Leander's intense gaze. You think my mother. I looked into your lineage, Genevieve, Leander said softly. Your mother Victoria was not a commoner, as Reginald claimed. She was a descendant of the forgotten house of Pembroke. When Reginald married her, he thought he was securing a pretty submissive Luna. Instead, he bred a daughter with the blood of ancient queens running through her veins. That is why my wolf is so volatile. Genevieve whispered the realization, crashing over her like a physical weight. She wasn't unstable. She was suffocating under Reginald's commands. And when Frederick Baines tried to force his claim, she defended her sovereignty. Leander finished, his eyes burning with a fierce, possessive pride. Baines is lucky you only scarred his face. Had you fully shifted, you would have torn his throat out. Leander stepped closer, invading her personal space. The scent of pine and dark earth enveloped her, making her inner wolf purr with a deep, rumbling satisfaction she had never experienced before. I brought you here, Genevieve, not just to save you from your father's foolishness. Leander murmured, his hand gently lifting her chin. His thumb brushed over her healed lower lip. The human kingdoms are rallying in the south, funded by traitors like Baines. My council demands I take a Luna to secure the royal lineage before war breaks out. They thrust endless parades of pampered, submissive duchesses before me. Genevieve felt a sudden sharp spike of jealousy at the thought of other women vying for him, which surprised her. But I do not need a submissive wife to sit quietly in a tower. Leander declared, leaning in until his lips were mere inches from hers. I need an equal. I need a queen who can bear the weight of my crown, who can fight at my side, and who will never, ever kneel. Before Genevieve could process the magnitude of his words, Leander closed the distance. His kiss was not a gentle question. It was a fiery, consuming claim. The moment their lips met, a brilliant, blinding spark ignited in Genevieve's chest. The void left by the silver pine pack vanished instantly, replaced by a roaring, indestructible golden tether. Mate. The word echoed in her mind, not a command, but a divine recognition. The Winter Solstice Ball was the most significant event in the Obsidian Citadel. The great hall of the fortress was transformed into a masterpiece of winter beauty, draped in black velvet and sparkling silver crystals. The allied lords and ladies of the Lycan territories were all in attendance, their political alliances hanging by fragile threads as rumors of war swirled. Genevieve stood beside the heavy velvet curtains overlooking the ballroom. She wore a gown of shimmering silver, a crown of braided white gold resting upon her dark hair. Tonight, Leander was to formally introduce her, not as a refugee, but as his intended queen. Below the hall was filled with the most powerful figures in their world. The key allied factions in attendance. House Hastings, led by Lord Richard Hastings, a staunch traditionalist who controlled the northern borders. House Davenport, commanded by Lord William Davenport, who had recently absorbed the disgraced Baines territory. The Royal Vanguard. The king's elite military leaders loyal only to the crown. Are you nervous? Leander asked, stepping up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Terrified, Genevieve admitted, leaning back against his solid chest. Half of these lords think I am a feral rogue who manipulated you into this. Let them think what they want. Leander growled softly, kissing the crook of her neck. "Tonight they will see the truth." The royal herald blew a heavy brass horn, silencing the murmuring crowd. Presenting his royal grace king, Leander Grayson, and his intended Lunar Lady Genevieve of the royal house. As they descended the grand staircase, the silence in the room was deafening. Genevieve felt the hostile, scrutinizing glares of the gathered nobility. She kept her chin high, channeling the ancient queens Leander had told her about. The banquet proceeded with tense formality. Genevieve sat at Leander's right hand, gracefully navigating the subtle insults and probing questions from the visiting lords. It was during the third course that Genevieve's heightened senses caught something wrong. A sharp, metallic scent cut through the aroma of roasted meats and heavy wines. Wolfbane. She scanned the room. Lord William Davenport was standing near the grand hearth, engaged in what looked like casual conversation with 3 heavily cloaked men who wore no house crests. One of the men subtly reached inside his cloak. Genevieve's wolf surged forward, a primal scream echoing in her mind. "Leander down!" Genevieve shrieked. She didn't wait for his reaction. In a fraction of a second, Genevieve leapt over the massive banquet table. The shift was agonizingly fast, but completely flawless. There was no pain, only the explosive release of power she had suppressed her entire life. She hit the floor not as a woman in a silver gown, but as a colossal, magnificent white wolf. Her fur shimmered like fresh snow under moonlight, and her eyes burned with an ethereal, icy blue fire. She was larger than any female wolf in recorded history, easily matching the size of the king's own midnight black beast. The hall erupted into screaming chaos. The 3 cloaked assassins drew heavy crossbows loaded with silver wolf-bane-tipped bolts, weapons capable of dropping an alpha king. But they were aiming at where Leander had been sitting a second prior. Genevieve crashed into the assassins with the force of a battering ram. Her massive jaws clamped down on the first man's arm, crushing bone and metal in a single bite. She threw him across the room with a flick of her powerful neck. The second assassin managed to fire a bolt, but it grazed her thick, protective shoulder fur, doing no damage. She spun her heavy tail, sweeping his legs out from under him, before she pinned him to the stone floor, baring her razor-sharp teeth inches from his throat. A deep, earth-shattering roar shook the dust from the chandeliers. Leander had shifted. His monstrous black wolf stood atop the head table, his golden eyes fixed on Lord William Davenport, who was currently trying to flee toward the exit. The obsidian guards moved in perfect unison, blocking the doors and drawing their broadswords. The rebellion was crushed before it could even begin. Genevieve held the assassin down until the guards secured him in heavy iron chains. Slowly she stepped back, her chest heaving as adrenaline pumped through her veins. She looked around the hall. The lords and ladies of the Lycan territories were staring at her, their faces pale with absolute awe and terror. They were not looking at a broken, banished girl from a starving pack. They were looking at a legend reborn. Leander's black wolf leaped down from the table, padding slowly toward her. He stopped in front of her, his massive head lowering in a deep, respectful bow. It was the ultimate display of submission and partnership from an alpha king. Seeing their sovereign beau, Lord Richard Hastings immediately dropped to his knees. Lady Eleanor followed. Within seconds, every single wolf in the great hall, from the highest lord to the lowest servant, was kneeling on the cold stone floor, their heads bowed in total submission to the Lunar Queen. Genevieve let out a long, triumphant howl that shattered the stained glass windows and echoed far out into the frozen mountains. She was no longer a banished rogue. She was the storm that had come to rule them all. What an incredible journey of betrayal, hidden bloodlines, and ultimate triumph. Genevieve went from a broken, banished daughter to the most powerful queen the Lycan territories have ever seen, proving that sometimes the ones cast out into the cold are the ones destined to rule the storm. If you loved this dramatic werewolf romance and want to hear more thrilling stories of Alpha's magic and revenge, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more epic tales.